Or might it be to go in the opposite direction, to go still further, that is, in the movement of the market, of decoding and deterritorialization? For perhaps the flows are not yet deterritorialized enough, not decoded enough, from the viewpoint of a theory and a practice of a highly schizophrenic character, not to withdraw from the process, but to go further, to accelerate the process, as Nietzsche put it. In this manner, the truth is that we haven't seen anything yet.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is to the whole state of things, a pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Thanks for joining us on another edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, we're sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce our guest today, just want to throw out, we do have a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. If you're enjoying the show, please consider throwing us $1 a month there. And, we understand times are hard, so if you can't contribute in that capacity, consider dropping us a review on iTunes. And if you say, "Fear is the mind killer" in your review, I will give you a shout out on the next week's episode. I want to give a shout out to Sean M_M for dropping the banger episode review on iTunes. Our guest today is Gil, co-host of the What's Left of Philosophy podcast and translator of French philosophy. Gil is joining us to look at the last 3 sections of Anti-Oedipus. And so
Chapter 3,
yeah. Gil, thanks so much for joining us. You can now read us line by line of your CV, and then we can get started.
Wow, thanks so much for having me. It's really exciting to be here. I love this project. I love the pod, and it's a delight.
It's interesting. We were talking before we started about how you and I both kind of came upon Anti-Oedipus at a formative stage when we were really, I guess, starting to get into philosophy. Do you want to say just a little bit about either recap what you told us, or maybe say just a little bit about what this text means to you and kind of why we wanted to reach out to you and have you on today?
Yeah, I first encountered this book over 10 years ago when I was an undergraduate studying philosophy. And I actually took a class in the philosophy of contemporary music in which I read the refrain chapter from A Thousand Plateaus. And it really spoke to me, as you all know, like just a very different way of thinking and, very productive generative concepts. It seemed capable of like producing something. And so when time came to like pick a project to work on for like a thesis, I suggested this Thousand Plateaus project to my director, the chair of the program at the time. And he said, well, why don't you do Anti-Oedipus instead? Unlike A Thousand Plateaus, that book has an argument. You can actually structure a coherent project around it. And so that's what I did. I spent like an entire year really deep in this text. And it honestly, maybe more than anything else, was like intellectually formative for me and changed a lot about how I thought about myself in relationship to others, thinking about questions of like emergent subjectivity and its relationship to desire, the primacy of desire, and how all of this sort of stuff is configured in relationship to social formation, social organization. And it's obviously also a really powerful and in some ways disturbing critique of capitalism that kind of pulls open Pandora's box and shows us just what we're dealing with here, the unnameable thing. So it's like a really important book for me, and I haven't spent tons of time with it. And a lot of that time in the interim, I got really invested in early modern philosophy. And so I'm really excited to come back to it and talk about it with you all.
I like this notion that at least Anti-Oedipus has an argument, because counterintuitively, or at least as a juxtaposing against what your director said, A Thousand Plateaus is written on, there's so much secondary literature on it. There's so many analyses of it. And obviously you could just take a passage out of a plateau, not let alone one plateau, and have theses written on it. But Anti-Oedipus
100%.
doesn't really feel as well plumbed, even if it was kind of an immediate quote unquote bestseller when it came out.
Yeah, it's true. There's comparatively much less written on it, and its sort of reception in Anglo-American philosophy, I think at least, has been much more muted, I think, in the long run. They say about 1,000 Plateaus, right? That you should treat it like a record, right? And maybe you like a certain track, and so you run out the grooves on that one. And if you don't like one of the plateaus, like skip that track, right? And I think that allowed a lot of people to pick up and work with it. It's a toolbox for whatever it was that they were interested in the moment. Whereas Anti-Oedipus really does focus your attention on a couple of precise, specific kinds of problems. There's like one piece of secondary on it that I actually quite like by John Russin called Desiring Production in Spirit, which like reads what's going on in this book as like a very heterodox entry into like post-Kantian German idealism, which is fascinating. We're like, desiring production is something like Geist. Like this is the proper way to understand now also universal history on top of everything else.
Pache Deleuze, sorry Deleuze. Like
I think that
oh, of course,
Ray Brassier was saying something like that, right?
I think so. I think we kind of got him to say something like that. I might have put the words in his mouth to mention something like this, that perhaps Deleuze and Guattari, perhaps Anti-Oedipus completes German idealism or something. It was kind of a quip, but
maybe it was Dan Smith. I'm thinking of
maybe
because he was really going in on the way that the three critiques sort of align with.
That's right.
I forget what the three what it matches up to, but it's something like God, the family, and I forget what the others are, or other is rather.
It's the Holy Trinity, right? And so that makes sense.
World and soul, right?
Dan Smith is also helpful because he reads Deleuze in terms of like an inverted critique of Kant. So it makes sense coming from him.
It's also the case that in Anti-Oedipus, they write explicitly at some point that what they're doing is a transcendental materialist analysis.
Yes.
Right? Yeah, a transcendental materialist analysis of desire or of desiring production, where like the question is in chapter 2, I know you guys have done like a ton of episodes just on chapter 2, but after you identify each of the three syntheses of production or of desire, the task analytically is to distinguish between its immanent and its transcendent usages.
That's right. Yeah.
It's like a transcendental dialectic of desire, right?
And they use the term paralogisms, right?
They do.
The unconscious,
explicitly.
So it is, you're right. It is, that's a good point to bring up about this. Maybe if they completed German idealism with Anti-Oedipus, then why is there, they already had a projected volume 2. I guess because I think, was it I was either Staval or Dan who said that there was so much in the Anti-Oedipus papers, which gladly have been translated, that it was almost like they were already working towards 1,000 Plateaus, which
concurrently was kind of the vibe.
Which is kind of interesting because it goes against, because I reread the Nick Land pieces that you cite in your paper, because Gil shared with us one of his papers specifically on some of these sections that we read, Capitalist Unbecoming, Disintegration, Displacement, and the State Form. That's the title of your paper. You cite 2 Nick Land essays, which are commonly, which was like the early Land, right? Kant, Capital, and the Prohibition of Incest, and then Making It with Death. I forget the subtitle. It's on Deleuze, right? So
what is it? Making It with Death.
Well, just making it with that. But the main point I'm saying is with Nick Land's reading, Anti-Oedipus is kind of the radical critique and has these radical takes on death, and 1,000 Plateaus kind of pussies out on it, right? And kind of tries to become this cautionary tale and all of these things. But it's interesting that they would have already had so much to work from,
right?
That some of the bulk of 1,000 Plateaus was already in formation. So at the time that this was published. So, it's hard to square against his kind of picking and choosing between the two.
Was that Dan Smith or Staval that had said that? Because Staval had gone to Warwick, I think, for a conference at one point back in the sort of heyday of the CCRU.
It was Staval who didn't want to name drop Mr.
Right.
Land.
I suppose you're right.
So anyway.
It's a minefield. I think that there is something to the take, though. There is something, even like the line that you read, Coop, at the beginning of this, right? The end of section 9. Right, like maybe the thing is to just go all the way in the other direction, continue along the deterritorializing, schizophrenizing process, right? The absolute limit. And I do think that they are much more, and that's like the end of the book too. Like by the time you get to the end of part of chapter 4, like they're saying things like, we'll never have gone far enough in deterritorializing, right?
Yeah.
But then by the time you get to, the chapters like on the BWO in 1,000 Plateaus, like they're much more cautious and restricted, I think. They want to like say things like, don't go too fast. There's always these like forms of relapse. You can lose yourself in a way that's not productive. You can become like a toxic body without organs, or an anemic one or something like this.
Some of this seems like it becomes the notion of strata and destratification and even desubjectification become much more of a touchstone in 1,000 Plateaus, then even the notion of strata or stratification isn't really articulated as much here, right? It's different terminology. And we talked before the episode about, Bias for Boire, the Abecedare episode or Abecedare letter on drinking, where, Claire Parnay, the interviewer, is kind of pushing Deleuze about the reception of the work with Guattari and by young people, and this notion that one of the stereotypical critiques was that it gave kind of like a free reign and a free license to experiment with drugs and all these things. And, Deleuze gets a little defensive. It's one of the
touchy, yeah.
He gets a little defensive about this. And so I wonder too, if part of the caution that really comes out in 1,000 Plateaus that we're describing and that Nick Land points out very clearly in Making with Death as some of the things that he's finding issue with is some of the reception seems to have been this critique where it's like, oh, your revolutionary heroes are schizos, and you're just all about taking drugs and, tune in, drop out, whatever the fuck, and I wonder if that's some of the sensitivity that gets channeled into the second volume.
No, that seems right. Yeah. And I mean, he's very clear in that interview. It's true that that was never their intention to encourage that sort of fully disintegrative libertinism or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Especially from the perspective of political movement. This is clearly a book that wants to engender militants.
Yes.
And it's pretty hard to be a good, well-organized militant if you've just tuned in and dropped out.
That's a good point. And it seems like the theme of the revolutionary machine and the analytic machine kind of working together, they seem to have been read as though they were separate, and the thing that separates them is just taking drugs. Although in 1,000 Plateaus they're more explicit about Castaneda, Don Juan, and these things. But again, it's kind of a cautionary tale as well. Anyway, this is all kind of just context for discussing some of these things that are in the background of this analysis. And the first section we have on section 9, well, I guess the 3 sections we have: the Civilized Capitalist Machine, right, is section 9. I think section 10 is called Capitalist Representation, and then section 11 is Oedipus at Last.
Right.
Yep. Just to give and of course, in these kind of things, the question of where to begin is always fun. But I do like the opening lines of 9. If I remember, it's the first great wave of deterritorialization comes with the despotic machine, but it's nothing in comparison to the decoding of flows, which is what we will see in full force in the Civilized Capitalist Machine. And one of the things that I thought was interesting, although I'll let you guys open up and go anywhere you want with this, was that they kind of say, look, the desire for decoding and decoded desires have always existed. Just history's full of them. It's just that the kind of generalized, almost programmatic decoding of flows that capitalism and the capitalist machine is based on only comes into full force through this kind of contingent conjuncture of all sorts of factors. So I don't know, I guess just kind of jump off from there. I don't even want to lead you guys into a question, just kind of thinking about these things broadly.
I was thinking about what Dan Smith said about Deleuze being a philosopher of time and its relation to the despotic machine, because one of the things they say early on in this section is this interesting gap that occurs, and these two different methods or ways that time operates at the synchronic and the diachronic. And they talk about how the despotic machine is synchronic, but the capitalist machine is diachronic. And that's why there's such an extended amount of time that passes between the Roman Empire, for example, and the development of capitalism, of modern capitalism during the industrial empire and beyond, or age and beyond.
This is the Erstadt hypothesis, right? It appears all at once in this flash. All of a sudden there's transcendent unity and overcoding. But then capitalism has this sort of, it comes in weird waves. And part of the reason for it having to come in waves is, on the one hand, as you said, Taylor, it's a wild series of completely contingent convergences. And in fact, as they point out, this is sort of fascinating too. The conditions for the possibility of the emergence of capitalism existed for a long time in a lot of different places. So the question becomes, why then now? Or why at that time and not elsewhere, else when? And in part 2, so there's that. And then the other thing is, it's because of the sort of double movement of the axiomatic. It can't have appeared all at once, right? Yeah. The sort of deterritorializing but reterritorialization, the sort of the production of neo-territorialities on the basis of this movement, generalized movement of decoding, it being like the heart of this new thing. That can't have appeared all at once. It's this kind of double movement or tension.
Would either of you be able to maybe articulate this kind of distinction between the synchronic movement and the diachronic for me?
We're kind of like
Moving towards
paraphrasing
that,
it, right? Because, you know, as Gil said, it comes in a flash. I think Nietzsche says they come like lightning, right? The founders of the state, the blonde beasts of prey, and he has all kinds of interesting ways of describing them, and they're kind of running with that too in the Erstadt hypothesis, where it's like it's almost as though every time archaeologists dig deeper and find an older state, there's one beneath it, right? It's like states all the way down, even though theoretically at least that's both impossible and yet seemingly incontestable, right? There is this kind of paradox there. That's the synchronic aspect. And the diachronic, you know, as Gil was kind of pointing out, even though all the conditions were there, perhaps, you know, even further back than Rome, but definitely not just in Rome, in China. I mean, I think we've had this discussion too in the Libido Economy series, right? Where Lyotard kind of goes through the same questions about
Taoist erotics. And all that.
Well, but also why in China in like the 14th century didn't capitalism come up? And it's like at a certain point, they got enough silver out of the mines and they paused. You know, it wasn't just this movement towards the axiomatic whereby capital stops being where financial capital, merchant capital stops being kind of just immersed back into the old body, into the despotic machine, and kind of encased it and kind of cordoned off, and whereby it becomes filiative capital, right? Where capital starts to beget itself. And do you have anything to add to that Gil, about this diachronic and synchronic distinction?
Yeah, I'm a history of philosophy person. Like when I think of the synchronic stuff, the kind of example that comes to mind for me and which helps make sense of it is like some of the weird origins paradoxes that you get like in Rousseau. The origin of, he asked this question about the origin of language, right? Yes. Like on the one hand, it seems like it would be necessary in order for language to have developed for there to already have been a community of people so that they'd be able to develop language amongst themselves. But on the other hand, it also doesn't seem like it would have been possible to have a community without there already have been a language amongst them in some way, right? And so this is the same sort of state all the way down problem. Right. It seems as though like it presupposes its own conditions, but also is what makes those conditions possible. And that's what I think of with the synchronic sort of flash appearance moment. And yeah, this is what they say about the state, right? And they're following class stress, right? Like the interesting question with capitalism is it's as though these previous modes of social organization were trying to ward it off always. You know, there's something about it being ever there on the horizon. What are the state mechanisms? What are the territorial mechanisms by which to prevent capital from becoming the self-moving substance, as Marx describes it, where it begets itself?
That's a good point to bring this question of capitalism.
Would the question
haunting?
When does desire become truly machinic? I suppose is that the dawn of capitalism? I suppose.
Well, they have that interesting quote about it's. I believe this is when they talk about, and I know we're kind of just looking ahead a little bit, when they talk about the breakdown of the old codes into the axiomatic, which I'm sure we'll talk about, but they also talk about knowledge capital, right? And the technological flows of code, which we can obviously, you know, in our day think of, they say data processing, but we think of obviously computer codes and things like that. When they talk about, it's no longer men who are the parts of this mega machine, but now men are adjacent to the machines. They kind of make this seemingly controversial statement. This is why it's truly under capitalism that we can say that capitalism begets machines, even though, you know, they mean that in a kind of provocative way, I think, in that context. And that's why they link it to machinic surplus value, right? And they link the worker and the worker and the technician kind of together under the conditions of being remunerated under wage salaries versus the financial capital that kind of, you know, in this weird mutant flow hollows out a debt to itself, you know.
Precisely, how money is created via debt, right? So like at the Federal Reserve or any central bank, they sort of make an entry on one side of the ledger, you know, negative $100,000, and on the opposite side, the plus $100,000 is the loan that goes out, right? And so they've effectively generated that entire positive notion of currency or value out of thin air.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
pay themselves back. But go ahead.
Yeah. I'm hoping that we can talk about specifically this concept of machinic surplus value, because it's one that I struggle with.
Yeah.
But it's as though the other way to put it, like self-moving substance, or like, why didn't this happen in China, where like they extract out of the silver mines up to a certain point and then stop. The other thing that they continually say about capital, and this is Marx's insight too, right? Like there is like a decoupling or disarticulation of production from even consumption as being its end, right? Like use value falls away in the sort of like orgiastic self-production of surplus and exchange value for itself, the valorization of capital, in relation to which everything else becomes totally subordinate and ancillary, subsidiary. There were studies, I was reading about this in a totally different context just recently. Some socialist historians were talking about looking at the development of agrarian production in early 20th century Russia. And like you get this sort of expansion amongst these like small landowning farmers up to a certain point where like, they're able then to satisfy their needs and desires. And then the expansion stops. There's not this sort of ceaseless accumulative drive or expansion for its own sake, which seems like absolutely characteristic of capitalism, right? This is totally unmoored from anything like the satisfaction of desire, at the same time that it seems like, oh, isn't this like desiring for itself in a weird way?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is actually like Stirner's sort of critique of ideology, honestly, or I don't even know exactly how to describe it, but he is, I think, recognizing that this sort of this production for production's sake, or I guess reproduction for reproduction's sake, is like the sort of immanent logic of capitalism, and we're sort of all thralls to it in a sense.
Yeah, what Marx called
between,
expanded. Yeah,
caught in the double bind.
Yeah, exactly. Like in the circuits of expanded reproduction. This is like the stuff that Marx teaches in part 7 of Capital 1, right? Even simple reproduction is already expanded reproduction. And that's in fact a limitless, endless process, alongside which we become simple like appendages of capital's movement.
One question or thing I wanted to bring up relative to machinic surplus would be, I guess, thinking about this in the sense of the way that you look at something like potlatch as a methodology in a lot of instances of preventing surplus accumulation and sort of maintaining this egalitarian, I've described it as like keeping the libidinal band from sort of overheating and like creating conflict or so forth. But I feel like, that's sort of tied to this, I guess, deterritorialized flow of capital and the surplus too. Like there's a connection, I feel like, there, because until you have that, it's that surplus, I feel like that has some type of mechanistic, or like that has some kind of impact in terms of how this capitalism comes on developmentally. Pre-capitalist societies warding that off, right? They try to eliminate surplus, the needless or wanton destruction of property or whatever gifts during the potlatch, for example, as a way to eliminate that surplus flow. But I can't quite draw the connection. I kind of see like a little rough relationship.
Matthias says similar stuff too, right? In like his like analyses of religious festivity and like the ecstasy of like festival and this like excessive, he talks about like, there being, I mean, when in Deleuze and Guattari's language, like something like an accumulative libidinal charge that requires periodic discharge, right? It's as though there's a recognition at some level that like, we shouldn't allow this to actually accumulate too much, right? This is going to be dangerous. And Bataille says something like, if we don't figure this problem out, it's just going to be total war and we're all going to die. And I think sometimes that he was right about that.
This is the interesting thing about what we're talking about here, which is what Deleuze and Guattari tried to define as, for the primitive territorial machine, as this development of a surplus value of code. And they try to talk about how that is, they even say that it corresponds to Moses' celebrated formula, the spirit of the thing given or the force of circumstance that requires that gifts be reciprocated with interest, being territorial signs of desire and power and principles of abundance and the fructification of wealth. I think that that's kind of what we're talking about here, is that, the gift burns a hole in your pocket and gets more intense, and you have to pass it on or pass it back with the counter gift in this. And what seems to be in the surplus value of code seems to be accumulating is prestige among these gifts and counter gifts. And with the introduction
symbolic value.
Yeah, symbolic value, right? I mean, that's since we've had Baudrillard on the brain for a long time, that's kind of how we'd say it. But it seems like with the introduction of the abstract equivalent of money, they have, I forget, was it the Teve economy they talk about? I don't want to have to, with the Teve economy, when that's just an example they use in these sections, when money is introduced as an abstract equivalent, these different kind of sectors that are semi-autonomous, even if also related with prestige goods, women, sort of use value commodities, not even commodities, but just these basic goods. When money is introduced as equivalent, it's as though the codes have to break down, because you start with money, you can start with money, you can end with money. And so the cycle can never come to a halt. A stock can never be reformed, within a kind of local measure. That's kind of one of the first ways they try to, or one of the simplest ways they try to articulate this notion of an axiomatic, which is different from the codes. And in this sense, it's money that gets money. It's money as the abstract general equivalent that I think gives the lie to the previous forms that we're talking about, like in Moses' formula of gifts and counter gifts, where it's not about an equivalent, right? There is no equivalent.
Yeah,
that's even
right.
how
Exactly
Baudrillard describes it.
Precisely. Yeah. And so this even goes back to an example that David Graeber used in the book Debt, where he's talking about, I want to say that it's these Celtic tribes women were sort of a currency. They would exchange something back to the family that is giving away the bride. And that was because there's no possible way to replace the bride that's being given away. But it's like the symbol, like we said, it goes back to symbolic exchange, right? There's not an equivalency. There's not a general equivalency. There is a recognition of difference, I guess, perhaps.
It's the analysis they give of the affiliation and alliance, right? That the first, the first preferential marriage is the aunt's daughter. But even
wait, can we just for my sake, could you explain these terms, alliance and affiliation? It seems like that's doing a lot of work in the kind of analysis they're elaborating. And
see, it's interesting, right? Because the whole chapter kind of builds on these terms. And so when they talk about financial flows and commodity flows, whatever, as no longer being dominated by alliance in the old pores of the bourgeoisie, but becoming filiative capital, right? Or they even call it industrial capital, where value is giving birth to itself, kind of as you were describing with the state and the what was it? The self-movement of substance.
Value as self-moving substance.
Yeah. So the way I read it, and the most general ways of defining it, even though they don't define it this way, is, filiation is more or less thought of in terms of, it becomes thought of in terms of descent, but it is sort of about matrilineal or patrilineal genealogies, right? It has a genealogical aspect, whereas alliance is actually negotiated by men. They even call it a primary homosexuality. It's negotiated by these local groups of men who are arranging the marriages in order to form bonds among families. So in a sense, they talk about, for example, affiliation in terms of the formations of stock versus alliances as the formation of these mobile debts. And so it's whenever but it's not that you can deduce alliance from affiliation, right? You can't. And I always think about, I don't know, you guys have seen Game of Thrones, right? So much of this can become more concrete out of the abstract if you just think about all the different negotiations that are going on between families.
Same thing in Dune as well. Yeah, it's all predicated on the exchange of affiliation.
And I think
alliance rather. Sorry.
Right, and I guess I just think that with affiliation in the tribes that Levi-Strauss is looking at, there will be say a local tribe, and they'll be broken off into two groups. Let's say there'll be A and B, and as Coop was talking about with, what was it? You say it was it Irish? Was it Gaelic?
Celtic tribesmen.
The Celtic tribes negotiating wives with these two groups. It all comes down to negotiating for you. Either the way they say it is you can't marry your mother because the affiliation has to extend, right? And you can't marry your sister because you have to give your sister out, right? And so it's this negotiation going on, this kind of this is why incest becomes prohibited, is because it becomes this like local strategy of groups. And this is why it's the maternal uncle who is owed gifts, because it's his basically the fact that he should be the one to marry the mother, right? But he can't do that. I mean, it's this inverse Hamlet thing that they're going on. I'm using all these different ways of going from just announcing. I should like just define it.
Your example of Game of Thrones is actually really good relative to incest, particularly not only because of like the relationship with Jaime and Cersei, but an even better example going back is Aegon the Conqueror, who basically was the Valyrian family that conquers Westeros, right? He marries his two sisters and their sister wives, and basically it's a common practice of the Targaryen dynasty to keep like an incestuous, in the books it's magically, they don't want to dilute their dragon powers or whatever, but I think you can still see how that really applies to the example you gave in terms of these small groups kind of, I don't know, using that to their advantage.
So they say at some point that like capitalism gets off the ground when like capital ceases to have like an alliance set of relations amongst its sort of constituent parts, right? Industrial, merchant, and commercial. And where instead it becomes filiative. It becomes kind of centered on itself or in a certain way, in which also allows it to appropriate everything else for itself. This new conjunction of productive forces aligned now on itself as, self-perpetuating and thereby self-expanding or something like this.
I think the old machinery operates very much like the way this works in Dune in terms of, I guess, the exchange of women. Something like, okay, so one of the major issues that set off the conflict in the first Dune novel is the Atreides and the Harkonnen sort of, what is it? It's like a feud, right? But the Bene Gesserit are manipulating. They're actually the ones that are doing the sort of homosexual selection in terms of like sexual selection in the background. And because this son, Paul, this male heir to the Duke was born, it really fucks up their plans because the Harkonnen basically is already a male, so they can't create that alliance, right?
Yeah, the exchange is no longer possible.
Precisely, and that sort of, I think that represents the sort of older alliance model of capital or whatever, and the sort of feudal time, I guess, or even you would say like mercantile almost is sort of how Dune operates.
To add on to this, I found some of my notes. They kind of define alliances as a continuing chain of debt relationships of an economic kind. So affiliation is administrative and hierarchical, and it's usually thought of in terms of kinship, right? In terms of descent, whereas alliance is lateral, it's political and economic.
Nice.
And it says, and expresses power insofar as it is not fused with the hierarchy and cannot be deduced from it, and the economy insofar as it is not identical with administration. Here's what's important, I think, for our discussion, where they say affiliation and alliance are like the two forms of a primitive capital: fixed capital or filiative stock, and circulating capital or mobile blocks of debt. So I think that's where they want to expand. Obviously, it becomes different in the despotic machine, right? Where there's the exogamous despot who comes and sort of rearranges all of kinship under him as like this kind of imminent unity of a god, and he kind of,
that'd be like Aegon the Conqueror coming to Westeros, and
Gilgamesh, or
yeah,
Paul Leto the second, whatever you're referencing.
William the Conqueror.
No. Yeah, so the despot is that overcoating unity that sort of, I always talk about this in terms of Gilgamesh, and I've probably already said it on this podcast before, but I love how Gilgamesh, one of our earliest epics starts where all the people of Europe come and they're complaining that Gilgamesh has prima nocte and he's fucking all their wives. And since he's 2/3 God, he's obviously going to have the firstborn's going to be his, because his semen is just like super impregnable, right? So that's kind of the overcoating where all affiliations now descend from Gilgamesh, and it fucks up the alliances, it fucks up negotiating. It's kind of this one last cry against the to ward off the state.
Man, it's really like that privatization of the individual and like the rise of the ego, in a sense. I feel like maybe like if you're looking at it historically speaking.
Well, instead of the organs being privatized in capitalist society, they're no longer completely collective, but they become the organs of the despot, right? They become the organs of the state. That's kind of that one last cry of like, hey, leave us some collective organs that aren't, overcoded.
What's great too is one of the things that runs throughout all of the analyses of the three different types of social machines that we get in this chapter is that they insist too that whatever's doing the work of being the full body is also at the same time an element of anti-production. Mm-hmm. And yet, like the sort of weird, not quite paradoxical thing is that it's this element of anti-production, whatever it is, the full body of the earth and the territorial machine, the body of the despot and the despotic, and now finally capital in capitalism, is this element of anti-production that appears to generate all of the production, right?
The quasi-cause.
Quasi-cause. The language that they constantly use is like there being an apparent objective movement, right? Where like this is now the thing that stands up and says, I am what is causing all of this to happen. Yes. At the same time that it is absolutely the element of anti-production. So yeah, at the same time, right, like, in the despotic machine, like the God King says, this is all mine. But what is he doing? He's sitting around on a throne doing nothing, right?
Right.
And in capitalism, everything appears to be produced by capital.
Yes.
Right. Which
that's
is like
why it's filiative. That's why it's filiative.
Yeah. That's why it's filiative, right? It's the thing that's apparently engendering everything. Mm-hmm. But of course, one of the other great contradictions of capitalism is that capital is not productive on its own. In fact, it is labor that is productive. And it's that sort of movement of appropriation that, I don't know, causes all the trouble, if you like.
Gil, I had a question because I've always struggled with this, or I've always had this in the back of my mind, because it's also a term that Laruelle uses, and I don't think he's getting it straight from Anti-Oedipus. I think, in fact, Deleuze and Guattari, or Deleuze specifically, is getting it. Is apparent objective movement, is this a term from Hegel or even before him? Is this a term that ever comes up, or am I projecting here?
The specific formulation, I don't know off the top of my head, but it's a very Hegelian and like even in a lot of ways like Marxist way of talking.
Maybe it is a Marxist terminology then.
Yeah, I could easily imagine this being language in capital, and I'm just not remembering exactly, right? What you get, for instance, is descriptions of, in Hegel, you'd look at like the doctrine of essence in the second part of the Science of Logic, where you have this whole like discussion of shine or of appearance,
right? And
like things having to appear in a certain kind of way, and that both being true and also just appearance, like objectively speaking, right? This is also what we get with, so many of Marx's analyses. I think about this in terms of like standpoint theory too. Like Nancy Hartsock has a really good piece, The Feminist Standpoint. She's building this idea of feminist standpoint epistemology on the model of Lukács, actually, in his reading of The Proletariat in Capital One. And you get this like description of the same situation from two perspectives, right? Where it is from the perspective of exchange, or the sphere of circulation, everything's great. It's all above board, baby. Entering into voluntary exchanges with one another. I'm selling the commodity of my labor power at its fair price, i.e. the cost of its production, what it takes to produce and reproduce me as a worker and reproduce that commodity. And like, everything's good, right? Like, this is what Marx says, right? Like the sphere of like equality, property, liberty, and Bentham, right? We're killing it. This is dope. But then from the perspective of the worker in the sphere of production, actually, it looks much different. It is coercion, it's force, it's violence, it's exploitation. And in a way, these are both true, but it's the sort of apparent objectivity of the sphere of exchange that needs to be chipped away at, right? Like that's only a one-sided perspective. The Marxist sort of take is that the perspective of production is the truer, more adequate one. So we're kind of like taking up some concepts like this and reworking it to talk about, one of the peculiarities of capitalism is where does it locate its quasi-causal anti-productive full body in its capital itself? This thing that really only can expand or valorize, but is made to appear or makes itself to appear. It's interesting to try to think about where agency is located in this whole situation, right? But it is made to appear one way or another, as though it is in fact doing the generation of everything other than itself, when really all it's doing is valorizing itself and subordinating everything to that.
To its own reproduction.
Yeah, expanded reproduction, exactly. Yeah. We've been doing cultural references to sort of illustrate points, but my favorite little representation in media of the non-productive body of the despot is actually in an early episode of Adventure Time, where our protagonist finds this weird little kingdom and accidentally kills their king. And so they're like, well, you're the new king now. And they've got all these problems that he wants to solve. And they're like, that's not allowed. You can't do anything. That messes up the code. And so he eventually replaces the king with a statue. And they're like, finally, we can do the productive work and have our non-productive center at the core.
Amazing.
I think it's called The Silent King. It's a really fun little episode.
That's almost like the way the chief would act in the
Yes.
like in the Pierre Claster's examples and so forth. Even I think most as well.
This thing about anti-production is interesting, right? Because they want to kind of say that, as Gil said earlier, right, just the despot claims in this apparent objective movement to produce everything when he's just sitting on the throne. They want to say that with capital, when capital becomes the full body, now anti-production isn't like, how do they say it? It's not this transcendent instance that's like outside and opposing production, limiting it and checking it. Like we said with, China got all of its, medieval China gets its silver and it shuts down the mines. That's kind of this outside force of anti-production. And they even talk about it in terms of, in the other two social machines, the previous ones, not necessarily evolutionarily, but in the sense of this book, anti-production is, and they even quote Balabar and Althusser here, where they kind of say it's extra economic. And they quote Marx too, saying that like, making the peasants work the land, it's always some extra economic force, right? But be it juridical or even, physical violence. But with capital as full body, anti-production becomes sort of imminent to the field of, it becomes co-present with production itself, right? And becomes firmly wedded to it in order to regulate its productivity and realize surplus value. They say this is the difference between the despotic bureaucracy and the capitalist bureaucracy, right? So I guess that what I found interesting was that they bring up anti-production the most when they're talking about knowledge capital, when they're talking about the technician and the scientist who they say as such, which I read as like statistically, they're not revolutionaries. In fact, they're the first to integrate and to be integrated. They're sort of the first to have their labor co-opted for these terrible ends, be it, gadgets to nuclear bombs. But they say it this way. They say the capitalist fusion of anti-production within production at all levels of the process is alone capable of realizing capitalism's supreme goal, which is to produce lack in the large aggregates, to introduce lack where there's always too much, by affecting the absorption of overabundant resources. On the other hand, it alone doubles the capital and the flow of knowledge with a capital and an equivalent flow of stupidity. And the French word there is actually connery, which is
interesting.
The word we have there is, it's actually linguistically related to the word for country, which is a fun word for like bullshit. So there's a flow of knowledge, and then there's an equivalent flow of bullshit that affects an absorption and a realization, and that ensures the integration of groups and individuals into the system. And I think that that's kind of part of this question of what the technological flows of code are. It's part of these two flows, the flows of knowledge, information, training in the axiomatic, and this flow of bullshit that is kind of forcing, statistically again, science and scientists and technicians into making bullshit. Making bullshit. Yeah,
making bullshit.
Right?
Making literally just more bullshit.
Just more bullshit.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I didn't know that it wasn't that it was connerie. I kind of assumed that it was bêtise.
I did too.
Because that's like, there's a whole thing in difference and repetition where Deleuze is like talking about transcendental stupidity, and there it's bêtise. So that's that's cool. I like bullshit works really nicely for capturing this. I think
it's bullshit. It's I think stupidity is only chosen here because it juxtaposes against knowledge, right? Those,
for sure.
I think there's more dark humor here, and there's more impact conceptually if we think about that. It's not that scientists are creating stupidity, although if we analogize and extrapolate, we can get to what we're talking about. But I mean, literally just creating more bullshit. And sometimes Guattari even talks like this, like with the cold open that Coop read, that accelerate the process. We haven't seen anything yet. Sometimes Guattari writes where he's like, yeah, we need more fucking gadgets. We need more widgets, more bullshit. We need more bullshit because it's almost like pushing anti-production to this point where it perhaps can help lead capitalism to its self-critique that they announce right at the beginning of chapter 3.
So it's like breaking from a thermodynamic model of this relative to the example I have about building muscle, right? So to like build muscle, you have to tear down the muscle fibers, introducing a stress there, but like also the body produces, I don't know if this is technically true, but right, there's like when the muscle gets tired, right, that's some type of, internal limit on the amount of work that it can produce, so that the muscle isn't obliterated, kind of a similar fashion to the libidinal band sort of overheating and bursting.
Yeah, lactic acid, and then it those micro tears allow it to regrow.
Is that like the anti-production would be the lactic acid? But it sounds like no. It sounds like that's maybe how the old model would work in terms of the potlatch, is like the way this lactic acid would absorb or slow down the expansion of the muscle before it erupts into violence or destruction or death.
I think your analogy works if the body we're talking about could literally expand indefinitely. What is this immersion of anti-production within production, if not the movement of what they're calling the axiomatic, which is this, capitalism is always coming up to its interior limit, but it keeps kind of widening them ever in this global planetary movement. And then it's got, even though it has, in a certain sense, schizophrenia has its exterior limit, it's always warding that off, right? Because that breaks through the wall and that kind of defeats the profit motive. So it's this, I think that your analogy works a little bit, just the human body is too small. It has to be like this cosmic full body.
True. But I think in the sense of the way that the internal limit is displaced, this example has a lot more currency and relevance in the way that it's crises being imminent to capitalism. And those crises are what allows for expansion. So it's like taking 2 steps back, but 3 steps forward. And so like, you put the muscle under stress by progressive overload. So more and more stress on the muscle tissue creates micro tears. Those micro tears heal. So there's a sort of that internal limit grows and grows, and you can kind of build that. Of course, like Taylor says, eventually you do run into a certain hard limit in terms of the physical body. But I think it's a good metaphor or example of the way that these internal limits can be displaced. And I think really when you get to the heart of the matter, it is the same process, because what are we really talking about? We're talking about a muscle has a capacity to do what? To produce, to labor, to produce labor power, to produce potential energy or whatever, or, you know what I mean?
Yeah. And so like crises economically are opportunities then for the displacement of the internal limit, both that are then recuperated in newly appropriated or accumulated capital on the one hand, and on the other pole, right, the expansion of a dispossessed larger proletariat, planetary wide, what Marx called like the industrial reserve army.
Yeah.
I like the stuff that they do talking about this actually in these chapters, thinking about center and periphery, thinking about, I have a lot of these conversations. I teach like business ethics classes, and like, sometimes, you get, and we all also, I mean, outside of that, we all like know people who look around and they're like, I don't know, this isn't that bad. And it's like, yeah, you are sure living in the imperial core, my guy. I'm sorry to tell you that. In fact, like the misery and servitude and drudgery of industrial production hasn't actually gone away just because we're living on the other side of the deindustrialization process, right? And they're talking about that actually happening already here. What it exports is affiliative capital to create new centers of production in places where, you have conditions for the maximal exploitation of labor. But then
not only labor, but environment as well, I think.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Like it's not only the physical and emotional stress, it's the environmental and the political stress are all exported to other places to allow the, imperial core to not, again, it's a ways of manipulating energies, right? Manipulating the flow of desire to keep the flows from like coming back and like destroying capital itself, right?
Right. Which again, we're running into limits. Actually, this turns out not to have been only theoretically potentially endless process. If you read the IPCC report that came out this past week, then you, like me, had a panic attack.
Do you want to fill us in, or is it too distressing?
Oh, just, scientists are just saying that like we need to reach peak emissions by 2025 if we're going to avoid reaching 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and emissions are higher every year. So we're fucked. We're pretty deeply fucked.
No one has even really grasped how completely fucked we are in my
only
opinion. Not to be a doomer, but
only Space Force,
like
Bezos and Musk can take us.
Well, yeah, I mean, and like this is
export it even further to the periphery.
Totally. Like I said, like I had a minor panic attack this week. On Wednesday, about 1,000 scientists associated with this group called Scientist Rebellion, some of whom were involved in the drafting of the IPCC report, who said that the language of it was actually watered down in order for it to get through committee, that it's actually worse than it sounds even. Did a bunch of like direct action. And so like on Wednesday, 4 scientists in Los Angeles chained themselves to the front doors of JP Morgan Chase.
Yes. Okay.
And they did that specifically because they identified political economically JP Morgan Chase is like the most significant investor in the construction of new fossil infrastructure projects that are happening right now. Which, by the way, like if you build a coal plant, it doesn't actually start turning a profit until like after 30 years of continuous.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So like it's suicidal on a planetary scale to be building any of this stuff at the moment. And like over 100 LAPD, in SWAT gear were brought in to arrest these four, like, nerd who pose very little physical threat to anybody. And that got like no media coverage, but everyone was looking at the, wow, Space Force, we got like, new star travels. This is absurd. Bullshit everywhere. Anti-production.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, because they talk about the death drive elusively here, although they talk about it much more throughout the book, it would be easy to say that, capitalism puts us on this death drive to ruin the environment and whatever. But, when Freud talks about the death drive and beyond the pleasure principle, he's talking about an organism not short-circuiting its own imminent ways of dying. So there's a certain sense in which, like, if, let's just say theoretically, the Earth as an organism is going to die in its own imminent way, then it shouldn't come from, we're not really allowing the Earth to die in its own manner. We're kind of imposing a transcendent imminent unity, whatever. Anyway,
we are, but more profoundly capitalist.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, yeah. And hate to talk about our implication in capitalism, but yeah.
Well, for sure. Well, there's a line here that I actually quite liked, thinking about, again, like the kind of coercive character of capitalist relations of production and exchange. It's on page 254, where they say, this ties together a bunch of the things that we've just been talking about. They write, quote, "The bourgeois field of immanence, as delimited by the conjunction of the decoded flows, the negation of any transcendence or exterior limit, and the effusion of anti-production inside production itself, institutes an unrivaled slavery, an unprecedented subjugation. There are no longer even any masters, but only slaves commanding other slaves. There is no longer any need to burden the animal from the outside. It shoulders its own burden." You get your good like Nietzschean beast of burden imagery here. And they even say a little farther down, they're like, yeah, in one way there is a ruling class and a ruled class. But on the other hand, the constraints of competitive marketplaces, for instance, mean that like people in the ruling class are forced to do what they do as well, right? There's like a kind of universal coercion as we become appendages or organs of the monstrous thing, right?
The great quote from Marx to cap off that paragraph, right? The capitalist is like the miser, but it's not, instead of it being an idiosyncrasy, it's actually a part of the social mechanism. And that's the distinction.
Just another wheel, just another cog.
Right.
What do they mean when they talk about classes as the opposites or mirrors?
The negative.
The negative of castes.
The negative of ranks, castes.
Because I'm interested
of castes and statuses.
I'm interested in pursuing this line of thought relative to the bourgeois being the revolutionary class as well, that I think sort of comes along after this aspect of the discussion.
They kind of say that the bourgeoisie is the only class because of this definition, right? The classes are the negative of castes and statuses, just as kind of the axiomatic is the negative of codes, or capitalism is the negative of all other societies. And I think that I read it as, I'm not sure necessarily if they believe it as strongly, or if this is as much of a declarative statement as someone like Ray Brazier made it out to be in his essay on the inhuman, because they do say elsewhere, obviously talking about there could be axioms for the proletarian class, etc. It's I think
from the point of view of capital, I think
yes,
a la Marx is what they're talking about. I think is my impression.
Yeah, I mean, they're
from the point of view of the historical development of capital, there's only one class that decodes the flow, or like is decoded, which would be the bourgeois, which kind of makes sense, right? Because if capitalism is the decoding of flows combined with, I forget what the other element is, but like whatever that composition is,
decoded flows of money and decoded flows of labor, right? Yeah. That's the conjunction.
And I guess before handing off to Gil, I would say, one in 1,000 Plateaus, they kind of move their analysis of micropolitics to classes and masses. So even there, they're not necessarily tied to this. But also, as we kind of talked pre-gaming, they want to try to distinguish, and maybe this is where classes and masses can be fitted onto this book too. They want to distinguish between the pre-conscious class interests and sort of unconscious investments of desire.
Yeah.
And so I guess we've kind of already laid it out, right? It's insofar as capitalism is the nightmare and the negative of all other social machines, this ironic retrospective history of class struggle, then you could say this, that the decoding class, there's one class.
I mean, if you look at like historically, the French Revolution, right, would sort of be a historical example of the bourgeois being the decoded class or the decoding class.
Yeah, as a
American Revolution too, to be even more direct, I think it would be.
Yeah,
because that really sets things off, and the way that they look at America and the westward expansion of America and etc. Manifest destiny and how that all applies with deterritorialization and reterritorialization.
Yeah.
But also
as
sort
regards,
of it's some, I don't know, it's a way for capital, it could continuously expand too, like in displacing that internal limit of the United States. Like you can see that sort of physical, like it's almost the way to the motion that plants have when they grow, right? Like if you've ever seen like sped up video of plants, right? They have this weird kind of like wavering when they expand, you know what I mean? They do move as such. But anyways.
Yeah, absolutely. I was struck thinking about this class question. This is really interesting. They sometimes seem to say that, like, yeah, is it them adopting the perspective of capital or the bourgeoisie from which they say that that's the only class? On the other hand, like, there's often this claim in like the Marxist tradition that like, no, the only universal class is the proletariat, right? And this is a kind of counterintuitive claim that they're making here, if you're familiar with that like line of thought. But then I also like was really struck by the way that they cite Sartre in the Critique of Dialectical Reason a little bit later, where like the problem maybe with thinking about classes and class struggle in this way is that, you know, Sartre writes that there isn't class spontaneity at all. There's just serialized members of, again, a pre-consciously interested organization or mass, I guess we would want to say. And then there are processes of like what Sartre calls groups infusion, which like is always tactical, local, and involves the sort of orientation of the forces available to subjects in a group that is only a kind of ephemeral unity. This might be the reason why they're like skeptical of classes.
Yeah, makes sense because they were definitely both very big Sartre heads.
They were because they do take him to task earlier in the book for beginning critique of the same book, Critique of Dialectical Reason, with scarcity instead of beginning with inscription as they do. Just to piggyback off of the Sartre, which is really on like 2 pages later from what we just read, the pre-conscious interest versus the sort of collective unconscious desires or investments. They also align it on this molecular kind of division, right? That class interest would be this kind of statistical molar aggregate, which again, this is why they bring up the serialized versus the groups infusion. What I found interesting was this notion that, and I'm glad that the translators provide a footnote, was this notion about the opposition between the class. When they talk about the theoretical opposition, it's not between two classes, right? And they say it's obviously because class is negative of caste and statuses. They say the opposition between the class and those who are outside the class, which they give the translator's note that it's the word they're using in French for class is outcast and outlaw. So I thought it was this interesting notion of an outclass. And maybe that's particularly this, maybe then they're not necessarily letting go of what you just brought up, Gil, about the only revolutionary class is obviously the proletarian. So maybe that's part of, it's maybe not necessarily a rejection of Marx, but this interesting theoretical kind of reconceptualization within their parameters.
Yeah, totally. And again, like thinking about, you know, on the one hand, of course, the proletariat could be the only revolutionary class, but also like how many reactionary proles are there? You know, like this is why like the Sartre reference is important. You know, even if it were the case that the pre-conscious interest of this proletarian class would be revolutionary, well, for the most part, what we are dealing with is serialization and a desire that is turned against its own interest. This is why you need something like a political project. And then like the hors class, right? The outlaw outclass, like this is what I think they're going to later thematize as like becoming revolutionary in 1,000 Plateaus, which is just not a given. It's not a given due to social positions, certainly.
Absolutely.
But involves Yeah, like they said, the servants of the machine and those who sabotage it, right? The people who are breaking down, the cogs can sometimes sabotage the machine. And that's not a given at all. This is a problem to be solved in a certain sense.
Yeah, it is interesting too that in this sense it comes back to the interior limits that capitalism is increasingly trying to export and expand, and the sort of absolute exterior limits of schizophrenia, which is why they kind of even bring up the difference between the capitalists or the bourgeoisie and the schizos and their basic intimacy at the level of decoding and their basic antagonism at the level of the axiomatic, which I find interesting, right? This kind of gets us back to one of the questions you had earlier, Gil, just to kind of jump, when we can always circle back, but this question of machinic surplus value, because they even say, that the sort of the theory of surplus value has to be corrected, blah, 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 towards machinic surplus value. But instead of like going through the sort of abstract steps that they lay out, one of the things, and I know Cooper's interested in it, is their example of when they give an example of anti-production and the sort of technological flows of code, they turn to Gregory Bateson. And it is this very interesting case, and we can kind of work through it in detail, right? I don't have the page, but they kind of say like
236.
Yeah, okay. So this is the interesting, like, so Bateson first starts, it's not like they totally reject him here, even though they kind of end with this ironic and almost sad note, because he's
like the
obviously
good example of the double bind.
Yeah, well, and
Not to spoil.
he formulated the double bind and in order to theorize schizophrenia, but first he's like doing ethnographic, ethnological interpretations of like Balinese culture. They get the notion of plateau from him, which furnishes the next title of their book. So he starts as an ethologist following the primitive codes and the savage flows. He turns to schizophrenia with the double bind, as Cooper just said, and these more decoded flows. And then he wants to keep breaking through that wall and he turns to dolphin language. But where does it end back up? Where it's like, but where does the dolphin flux end, if not the basic research projects of the American Army, which brings us back to preparations for war and to the absorption of surplus value. And then on the next page is what I was reading, the definition of surplus value must be modified. But I wanted to talk maybe a little bit about this example, I guess, right, of this trajectory they're building with Bateson. What do you guys think about that?
Neo-Possadism. I'm just kidding. Go ahead. I'm not sure, to be quite honest.
Well, you were interested.
Other than like, I guess it sort of goes to like this double bind in the sense that no matter what, you're going to sort of, as an individual or subject or whatever the fuck, you're going to bump into the internal limits of capitalism that sort of, it's almost like trying
it's
to
the flow of knowledge and the flow of bullshit, right?
Yeah. I mean, or like trying to hit the end of the rainbow in a certain sense. It's like it's totally constantly going to displace its limit and be able to create an axiomatic for even something as bizarre as dolphin language or something as deterritorialized or whatever as those of speech.
Yeah, that's actually super helpful. This is maybe why they revise Contraland, their statement, their prognostic towards the end of the book. Not because they've become conservative, Nick, but because, already here in this analysis, they're recognizing quite clearly, in fact, it's kind of the core of their conception of capitalist axiomatic as a distinctive social logic, that deterritorialization secures nothing, right? There's always at least the possibility of a reterritorialization of whatever is decoded, such that pursuing ever further deterritorialization might open up new avenues for, understanding or social organization or the satisfaction of desire.
Or markets.
But also markets, right? It's also potentially creating a site for new value extraction, a new locus of commodity production or of a flow.
Yeah, there could be an axiomatic for dolphin language. There could be even an axiomatic for little old us in our Oedipals.
Oh, for sure.
Totally fully axiomatized over here.
Yeah, by the way, visit my podcast's Patreon if you'd like to allow me to extract some surplus value.
God damn it. Even in our detail, even in our discussions of, even in this podcast is sort of trapped within the double bind of capitalism.
Yeah, we're extorting surplus value.
Yeah, well, this is the question, right? Given this sort of analysis, it's a little bit difficult to know what to do. Clearly, a regression to a more despotic regime of like overcoding is, let's just rule that out as not what we would like.
Yeah, exactly.
But
sorry,
also,
sorry,
like,
Baudrillard, we're not going to do it.
not doing it, not interested. But also, like, there's no simple answers on the side of deterritorialization either.
Agreed,
In as much as like that's the mechanism by which capital displaces its limit, its interior limit, right? And also, we don't seem to want to go in the direction of the absolute limit or the exterior limit. The absolute limit, that is like collapse into schizoid dissociation, is also not a particularly attractive prospect for me, at least. I don't know if you all have different feelings about that.
Or our immediate death, as Baudrillard would suggest.
Also not an exciting
like becoming
thing
a
for me.
terrorist or whatever, as the only sort of praxis left to us to sort of
it requires a more subtle response than like just deterritorialize and it'll work, because look what happens. You get Bateson's deterritorializing dolphin language, and next thing you know, you're back with the military industrial complex. Whoops, it's dangerous.
It's like a fucking horseshoe. Yeah, it's like horseshoe theory for real. That is the double bind, caught between two poles.
I do think it's interesting that they're able to bring all of this wildness, all of this to wrap these 10 sections of the development of the different types of representation, the primitive territorial representation, barbarian, despotic representation, capitalist representation, and work all the way up through the sort of history of coding flows, of overcoding flows, of decoding flows. And they sort of end section 10 by saying the general theory of society is a generalized theory of flows. And they're able to come back to Oedipus, right? Because for a while there, we may have forgotten that Oedipus was lurking, but
what's the name of this book? What are we talking
exactly.
about?
Is it anti-capitalism?
Right.
Yeah. So what I think is interesting, because just to start to get us to wrap up, because I know we won't be able to say as much as we need to. And Cooper and I have already been talking about Oedipus. We've been beating it like a dead horse, which in a certain sense it is.
Careful, you're going to give me, I'm going to have an episode. I'm going to go catatonic. They beat that horse one more time. I swear to God.
They talk about how in the primitive territorial machine, Oedipus is this empty displaced limit, right? It's not occupied. It's empty, unoccupied limit, I think is the way they talk about it. Because, with incest in the primitive territorial machine, you either have persons, but not names, or you have the names, but they don't stick to their person, right? Like it's always this limit, this, as they say, this shallow slandered stream. You can never occupy it. And then with the despot, he becomes he symbolically occupies it, but it's still not able to be lived per se. It's only with capitalism that now Oedipus becomes kind of shifts to the imaginary, and it becomes lived, and it becomes, we come to occupy it in our own little Kodak snap, right? The narcissistic ego is identical with the Oedipal subject. So it's like how we become little egos that have our little corner of the world, how the limit becomes internalized, right? All this talk about limits and external limits and internal limits of capitalism, it all comes back to help shed light on Oedipus. So I wonder what you guys think about just this kind of last section, if there was some stuff that maybe tied some things together for you, or some things that stood out.
Man, honestly, like my last really interesting question I wanted to bring up is not quite related, but I just want to raise it before I forget, would be that I don't understand where the fuck surplus is being generated at all. Was one of the big questions that I was kind of like not able to like square that loop. But anyways,
in terms of affiliative capital, in terms of
no, just like in general, like where the fuck is the surplus value generated? Like where, because they give this example about how the MCM formula, right? So money, capital, money, and about like purchasing, you take your $100 to purchase $100 of something, and then you take that commodity and sell that for $110. But that's still, I'm still trying to, I can't wrap my brain around where the surplus comes from.
So I can half answer this question because I'm also stuck on this as well. In the sort of classic articulation of this Marxist solution to the problem of the origin of surplus value is like chapter 6 of Capital One, where the relevant thing is that the value of labor power is not identical to the value that labor power produces in a particular, in a particular period of time, right?
Yeah.
So that like, and in Marxist language, that's variable capital is like, the actual living labor being done, remunerated with a wage. So, I'm paid $100 for my day's work, but I make $110. I make $150, $200 worth of product in my working day. So that's the origin of the surplus value on the one hand. This is going to open onto Marx's later analyses of absolute and relative surplus value. Increasing the degree of productivity of labor becomes an imperative of capital because the more my labor is productive, the more value I'll generate, and then the more surplus falls to the capitalist for the same amount of wage needing to be paid. And so this like satisfies all of the conditions of the economic problem where we are exchanging equivalence for equivalence. No one's getting swindled in that respect. But on the other hand, because of the sort of specific form of the wage relation, I'm as a worker able to generate more value than I'm paid. That's where surplus is coming from on the one hand. But then I don't understand how machinic surplus value works, which is there, I think, break with that sort of classic Marxist story.
Right.
Because the claim there is like, you got constant capital, right? Your means of production, your tools, your raw materials, your instruments of labor, that doesn't produce anything. That's just stuff that people use, workers actually put to work in the production process, and it makes your labor more productive, but the surplus is always coming from the laborer, right? From the worker.
Correct.
And then they say, but there's also, this is 232, yeah, they've got this line here, machines too, it's in scare quotes, work or produce value, and they've always worked. And they work more and more in proportion to man, who thus ceases to be a constituent part of the production process in order to become adjacent to it. Hence, there is a machinic surplus value produced by constant capital, which develops along with automation and productivity, and which cannot be explained by factors that counteract the falling tendency, increasing intensity of exploitation of human labor. So we kind of like hold this all together by the time we get to 237 to be like, yes, there is still the exploitation of labor. And here we have that core periphery discussion, right? Like we're moving that exploitation of human labor to the periphery, to the global south, the third world, whatever we want to call it. But also there is a process of extracting machinic surplus value on the basis of an axiomatic of the flows of scientific and technical code in the core areas of the center. So like, I don't know, I'm still a little unclear on how machinic surplus value works. How does constant capital produce surplus value? I don't know. Do you all have a kind of sense for this? This is something that I'm not sure I understand at this point.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I read it was that, there's this, how do they call it? I think it's back in fucking section 9. But there's the simulation going on. It's between
like finance, capital, and
wages, and it's as though you're measuring.
There are two different. It's almost like money is being used. It's a weird like duality within money to be able to operate. I don't know much, but I don't know, like thinking about this in terms of money creation, right? Like I mentioned earlier that, whenever currency is generated by debt, right, the Federal Reserve marks an entry to create the money. But I'm wondering too, like, if I'm not mistaken as well, like the Federal Reserve also, you might have to check me, I'm not sure if this is 100% true, but I believe that they lend out more money that can possibly ever be paid back. And that's how crises are imminent to capital because of that. Like it's sort of like, which is weird because I don't understand how surplus plays into that as well, because it's almost like musical chairs in terms of like the money is kind of flowing and then there's crisis and we all try to sit and then someone's left out.
That's a nice image. Yeah.
It's like almost a way to do scapegoating, but in a very like machinic fashion. Without, it's like a lottery, almost like drawing straws for who's gonna eat the sin and like take the L, basically. That's all very like, pulling stuff out of my ass.
It's also that like we've been saying, right, this like injection of the element of anti-production into the heart of the process again on an expanded scale, right? That like keeps the motors running, but by doing this completely, I don't know, untenable thing on the basis of like an irresolvable contradiction or something.
Yeah, one of the ways that I try to understand, because we talked about it a little bit earlier, right? About when they quote Schmidt and not Carl Schmidt, or maybe it's not Schmidt here. Maybe they're quoting Bernhoff, because Kerslake has a great fucking essay on this very question. But who is it that has the strange? It is Schmidt. It's Bernard Schmidt, not Carl Schmidt, the political kind of fascist guy. But he's talking about the flow possessing a power of mutation that does not enter into income and is not assigned to purchases, a pure availability, non-possession, and non-wealth, right? Where we talked about this hollowing out that banks do, right? They kind of enter a debt to themselves that they pay back, right? With their sort of interest and dividends and all this other stuff, kind of way that I understand them talking about sort of machinic surplus value is this kind of move from a point where financial flows and commodity flows were sort of limited, qualitative, sort of still trapped in this old body. And when there comes this point with the general equivalent of money and sort of the buildup, the breakdown of codes, that we have what they say, we move from the domain of the quantum or the quantitas, which here sounds like science of logic shit, to that of the differential relation as a conjunction that defines the immanent social field, particularly capitalism, and confers on the abstraction as such its effectively concrete value. It has taken upon itself the independence, the quality of the terms, and the quantity of a relation. The abstract itself posits the more complex relation within which it will develop like something concrete. Again, sounds like Hegel. But the point being, this is like Deleuze. He always goes to this where it's about differentials, right? It's dy dx, where dy derives from labor power and constitutes the fluctuation of variable capital, where dx derives from capital itself and constitutes the fluctuation of constant capital. It is from the fluxion, right, the rate of change at a given point of decoded flows from their conjunction, that the filiative form of capital x plus dx, which is like total value plus or value plus surplus value, right? That it's this differential relation. It's this purely kind of quantitative differential relation that from which quality results, rather than the opposite, right? Which was when we were back with codes, when different qualitative flows would sort of interact together, then they would sort of enter into the surplus value of code. But now they're in this, it's in this pure kind of surplus value of flux, value begetting value. And I think that that's where they say we've moved from the surplus value of code to a surplus value of flux, right? And I think that that's
okay.
That's when they start talking about the tendency to a falling rate of profit. And that's where they're talking about these different flows of money. And they're different like magnitudes, right? It's these different magnitudes that are almost incomparable. They say it's like trying to measure the distance between the stars and the distance between atoms with meters and centimeters, right? It's this almost absurd. They call it a dissimulation, right? It's almost a sleight of hand, but it's not like it's an illusion or it's like false consciousness, right? It is this. They kind of say, we could read this. Someone else maybe wants to read this. We can try to work this out, right? This full paragraph, right, of 237. Do we want to read through this? Otherwise, I feel like I'm fucking ranting.
So the definition of surplus value must be modified in terms of the machinic surplus value of constant capital, which distinguishes itself from the human surplus value of variable capital and from the non-measurable nature of this aggregate of surplus value of flux. It cannot be defined by the difference between the value of labor capacity and the value created by labor capacity. That was the story of exploitation I was telling before, but by the incommensurability between two flows that are nonetheless immanent to each other, by the disparity between the two aspects of money that express them, and by the absence of a limit exterior to their relationship. The one measuring the true economic force, the other measuring a purchasing power determined as, quote, income. The first is the immense deterritorialized flow that constitutes the full body of capital. Then they've got the whole thing on Schmidt. Should I keep going, or is that? We
could pause there. I think that that's interesting because they recapitulated exactly what you were saying when you were saying, like, I have the first half of the story, and I think that that's very much perhaps one of the main key components, right, of, as you said, chapter 6 of volume 1 of Capital. And so I think they're trying to build out this because they do say earlier with this difference between purchasing power and these kind of mutant financial flows that, what do they say, that's like the true, that's the meaning of the return to the Marxist theory of money, right? Where I think this is on 230, where they say one of Keynes's contributions was the reintroduction of desire into the problem of money. It is this that must be subjected to the requirements of Marxist analysis. This is why it is unfortunate that Marxist economists too often dwell on considerations concerning the mode of production and on the theory of money as the general equivalent as found in the first section of Capital without attaching enough importance to banking practice to financial operations and to the specific circulation of credit money, which would be the meaning of a return to Marx to the Marxist theory of money. So perhaps that gives us another clue of what they're trying to call machinic surplus value. This is where one of Deleuze's lecture, one of his seminars is good on this. And I would have to go back and look at it. I almost did, but where he actually spends a whole seminar talking about Keynes and
Cool.
and Anti-Oedipus to kind of
No way.
So
I need to see that.
Because it's this notion of non-possession and non-wealth, I think that is part of the paradox of what the machinic surplus value is doing here. The pure availability to sort of owe oneself money and buy one's own bootstraps, sort of pay it back off with interest, kind of like giving oneself a gift and accruing a more intense counter gift to oneself, right? To use the primitive kind of most model, I think that's part of the sort of contradiction.
Yeah, because
or the paradox.
Like we said just to use the example again of dual entry accounting, right? It's like those liabilities and credits sort of annihilate one another the way that proton and anti-proton might, or whatever.
That's a really interesting line that you drew our attention to, Taylor. Like the chastising the Marxists here for reading volume 1 and not getting to volume 3, basically.
Okay, there you go. That's
It's like, yeah, you all talk about money as though the last word on the subject is money as general equivalent, and not when, we get to volume 3, Marx is like all this stuff to say about fictitious capital and interest-bearing capital and speculation and loan capital. This sort of new set of relations needs to be taken into account. And so after Keynes has brought desire back into the economic question, okay, remember that other stuff. What does that look like? What is desire? What does desiring production in the context of speculative finance look like? That's going to be different than just noticing that there's a difference in magnitude between how much a worker produces and how much they're paid in the wage, right? Something else is going on there. So that does sort of help me understand a little bit better what might be going on with machinic surplus value. I still feel like I can't say it straight, but I feel like we're getting closer. You know what I mean?
The creation ex nihilo that we're talking about, right? That we've been talking about. And then there is sort of purchasing power or salaried wages, which they call the flux and the reflux, right? This is on the next page. But then they say, and this gets us back to anti-production and the role of the state and the military industrial complex and all that helps to absorb surplus value, right? Because they say if surplus value isn't absorbed, it's basically still virtual. It's not even, it has to be sort of actualized. And they say these revenues, they're talking about the flux and the reflux, right? And these revenues that continue to escape, these revenues are trapped by the firms and in turn form an afflux. So we have 3 terms here. Form an afflux by means of a conjunction, a flow this time uninterrupted of raw profit constituting at one go an undivided quantity flowing over the full body, however diverse the uses for which is allocated, interest, dividends, management salaries, purchase of production goods, etc. So this is I think that the afflux, just to simplify, I think that what I understand by afflux is this becoming imminent yet incommensurable of these other 2 flows, right? Of sort of
wage capital,
right? Exactly,
and finance capital.
Yes,
I am reminded of that. It's from much earlier in the book. I think it might be from chapter 1 where they say something like, "Everything makes so much sense except for that it is completely irrational at its core." There's this systematic character to capitalism, and it's form of development and expansion that it's all perfectly rational except that it's fucking crazy. I feel like I'm having one of those vertiginous moments where it seems like it's both somehow, and trying to think about afflux and reflux here.
This is good too because it helps to shed light on something they say. This is 232 and 233 where it's if you consider Adam Smith to have talked about this abstract subjective wealth making attribute, just as Luther talked about faith in terms of this abstract subjective attribute, and Freud makes the libido into this abstract subjective attribute. There is this sense in which you have personified capital, the capitalist, the worker, the merchant, the banker. But on the other hand, you have every technical machine presupposes a particular type of flows of code that are both interior and exterior to the machine, forming the elements of a technology and even a science. In pre-capitalist societies, these are kind of cordoned off, and they'll keep talking about this in A Thousand Plateaus with like metallurgy and the blacksmith, and those are suspect, in earlier formations and have to be watched over. But they say, but the decoding flows in capitalism has free, deterritorialized, and decoded the flows of code just as it has the others, to such a degree that the automatic machine has always increasingly internalized them in its body or its structure as a field of forces, while depending on a science and a technology, on a so-called intellectual labor distinct from the manual labor of the worker. In this sense, it is not machines that have created capitalism, but capitalism that creates machines, and it is constantly introducing breaks and cleavages through which it revolutionizes its technical models of production. And I think, again, this is how they get us debates in, how they're trying to explain how the axiomatic functions in these differential relations of pure quantities, only after which we can have equality rather than the other way around with codes and flows. I think that adds a little bit more to why they choose the word machinic here, even though it's one of Guattari's favorite words. It can't be that arbitrary.
It's on that same page, a little farther down on 233, that they say that the true axiomatic is that of the social machine itself, which takes the place of the old codings and organizes all the decoded flows, including the flows of scientific and technical code, for the benefit of the capitalist system and in the service of its ends. So it's right. It's not as though labor exploitation's gone away, but it's also working on figuring out how to extract value from treating codes. And I don't know, I think here maybe that they're thinking about something like technical knowledge, right? Or, they're tying it here to like technology and science as kind of like becoming unmoored or autonomous from its initial sort of site of discovery or enunciation, and then figuring out how that too can be productive or generative of value for itself, as with everything.
I wonder how this relates to, say, something like cryptocurrency, which is even a further abstraction of money, right? Like it's an even more bizarre and machinic evolution of money. Cryptocurrency has such a bizarre thing because it's not really, right? It's not quite currency. It's more like
it's unusable qua currency.
It's more like an asset, a new asset class, but it's like got machinic components to it that are sort of have some interesting relationships.
Absolutely. No, and it like at each stage of its architecture as a technology creates sites for the extraction of further value. So like itself is clearly, like we said, not at all meant to be used as a currency. Like even just because like to transfer cryptocurrency, like that costs sometimes like between $50,000 and $10,000. So like you're not going to be buying a cup of coffee with that. So it really on the first stage is just like an instrument of financial speculation where like, tying in with like things like NFTs, it's like you want people to buy an NFT, which is to say add to the blockchain in order to do that. And then the idea is you're going to be able to offload it later to another mark. It's basically a multi-level marketing scheme, right? You need more people to buy in so that you can sell your asset that will now have appreciated in value. But subterranean to that too is that the adding to the blockchain technology, the what is it called? The mechanism, proof of purchase. I forget. I think it's a proof mechanism that you are the one who gets to add to the next line of the blockchain. Means you solve an increasingly complex mathematical equation, which really means that like the input here is processing power and maybe more fundamentally like energy, like electricity.
Right, going back to like my muscle metaphor, right?
Exactly.
Pure energy, pure capacity to perform work of some type, right? Whether that's actual material work or like virtual work.
Right. Building a warehouse full of even more powerful computers to solve the equation faster is an increasingly displaced limit, right?
Yeah, exactly. Interesting.
I despise cryptocurrency. I don't know if that's clear. I think it's one of the worst things going right now.
That's one of the good things about Twitter and perhaps other social media sites, hopefully, is the disdain for crypto bros and NFTs.
Well, for me, it's like a rehash of Web 2.0 because that was going to be, and I bought into it quite, because I was kind of like in grad school during that period of time whenever social media was really erupting, and like I thought, oh yeah, this is going to be great, this is really going to open up voices and so forth to do something and like democratize and be like this deterritorializing force. And nope, there was the commensurate reterritorialization. Another like, again, so this actually goes to something that Deleuze and Guattari say in Anti-Oedipus in this section, is talking about how the commons are continually like, it's not just, or primitive accumulation, right? It's like, it's not just at the dawning of capitalism that primitive accumulation occurs. It continues.
It's dawn of all time. Yeah.
It's a continuous process. And you can see that this is like basically, you can kind of see that the way that the big tech companies like Apple, Google, Twitter, Facebook, etc., have really, the digital commons have been captured or whatever. Those are no longer exist in a sense.
Yeah, what's really great about that example too is that the first pass understanding of like original or primitive accumulation is like there is literally land in common that is subject then to enclosure, right? And on that understanding, you might think that, well, there's like a finite set of things that can be captured and, privatized and turned into a market and subject to market logics for like, the production or valorization of value. But with like the digital commons, with the stuff like NFTs, it's like, no, they're like producing a new commons to then be
right. Yeah, exactly. It's almost like the money. It's almost like the surplus money to, you know what I mean? Like it's kind of the same, like producing something out of nothing.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's abstraction.
Yeah. Then like, exactly. Self-moving substance. We hate to see it.
The decoded flow, man. It escaped. And now now we're thralls to it.
Yeah.
Oedipus at last. Oedipus at last.
Yeah, sorry, I totally hijacked your.
Yeah, we kind of got away from you.
No, I mean, we may not have time for it. I
didn't really draw anything. The stuff we kind of have already discussed, I think, was what I was like more drawn to, this kind of political economy and like drawing on the marks and flux and money and surplus, etc.
It's definitely the denser and more difficult stuff. And I was wondering in my head reading this was if Oedipus at last was a dark, humorous statement like free at last, yeah. Right? If it was like playing off of that, or if that was just it's probably the translator's dark humor, if anything, right? I'd have to check the French, but one of the only interesting philosophical things besides the culmination of the whole chapter was the way that Deleuze uses simulacrum in a way that is negative, because in the appendix to logic of sense and then difference of repetition, Deleuze is kind of on the side of simulacra. He's like,
right.
He's like, hey, let's fuck up Plato and
yeah, overturn Platonism.
Let's overturn the copy model distinction, and but here he's using it in a way that seems Platonic, and it's only in the very last paragraph where he is trying to kind of use simulacrum in a way that itself could be talking about pushing Oedipus to its auto-critique, right? To its self-critique, just as the whole chapter was about capitalism being able to conduct its own self-critique. And so sort of Freud doesn't get us there, right? It's like Freud doesn't quite get us to Oedipus conducting its own self-critique. And so he says, to discover beneath the familial reduction the nature of the social investments of the unconscious, to discover beneath the individual fantasy the nature of group fantasies, or what amounts to the same thing, to push the simulacrum to the point where it ceases to be the image of an image, right, Plato, so as to discover the abstract figures, the schizas flows that it harbors and conceals. And the last sentence kind of brings us back to the very first chapter of the book: to overturn the theater of representation into the order of desiring production. This is the whole task of schizoanalysis. Right, which I don't think they mean that one last sentence, that little list that they give of Oedipus conducting its own critique. So that use of simulacrum, he kind of shows his hand that the way he's using it is precisely in a kind of Platonic sense, that when we say sort of we all have our little internalized colony, right, which kind of makes sense in light of everything we've said about the periphery and the core and the axiomatic, the way he's deploying simulacrum is now kind of in an ironic Platonic gesture and no longer in the way in which he's tried to appropriate it to turn it against Platonism. So I just thought that was a kind of an interesting little like footnote to add.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's continuity here. There's continuity with his earlier projects, right? Like this is also like the task he sets himself, and then think in a difference in repetition, right? Like representation is that which like stifles or suffocates difference in itself,
yes,
in its various forms. And I think that book fails on its own terms for a variety of reasons. And it's as though like he still is obsessed with this problem of overturning the theater of representation. But now with Guattari seems to recognize that like, oh no, this has to be like a political project that contests Oedipus and capitalism directly. You can't just do it by, I don't know, reading Duns Scotus better or something.
Yeah,
to be really flippant.
I mean, even if there are political stakes in difference of repetition and logic of sense, his two kind of like I won't say masterworks, but his two mature works,
Yeah.
not the non-monographs, those political, besides perhaps the Image of Thought chapter in Different, which is the one towards the end of his life where he's like, if there's one thing I'd keep from Different Repetition, it'd be Image of Thought that stands on its own. And I do think that
still about it.
That still has the most political consequences. But in terms of the rest of the project, if it's still kind of in the background here, obviously with Guattari, he's mobilizing those forces he's tapped into, as you said, these other these other philosophical projects, and he's tapping them directly into a militancy, to a revolutionary machine, right? That's kind of Guattari's merit there.
I will just say that I think it's very funny that he calls Freud the Luther and the Adam Smith of psychiatry. I just think that's great.
That's why I had to drop that just a minute
It's
ago.
a good line.
When I was kind of talking about I had to drop those in because I like that too. That was
He's got a couple of these moments. They have a couple of these moments, right? Earlier, he calls him like a masked Al Capone and a Sophocles.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's right. He calls him because I forget all three of them, but they reject.
There's a third one. Yeah.
Well, they have three aspects of Freud that they lay out, and a racketeer is one, right?
Yeah, the masked Al Capone.
Yeah, the masked Al Capone. Also, he becomes kind of this dogmatic grandfather that's worried about psychoanalysis future, which might be but the thing they want to preserve is the sort of young, adventurous, exploratory Freud, right?
The Freud of the three essays. Yeah,
exactly. Any last thoughts, Coop, Gil?
I'm fluxed.
Fluxed out.
Out, man.
Blissed out on flux.
The anti-production has sort of come into play now.
The lactic acid has seized up the production.
A little bit, libido band is beginning to sort of reach a stasis point. Yeah, exactly.
Well, Gil, plug your projects and let our listeners know where they can follow you.
Sure. Thanks so much. I am one of the co-hosts of a podcast called What's Left of Philosophy. You can listen to it basically wherever you get podcasts, Spotify, Apple, et cetera, et cetera. We do have a Patreon if you want to support us, but you should listen to our episodes. We keep a lot of them unlocked. We only have some exclusive content. You can follow us at Left of Phil on Twitter. I'm on Twitter too at GD, my last name, GD Morejon. And this was great. Thank you guys both so much for having me. It was a delight.
I'm really glad we took last week off so we could work you in. And I'm so glad that this book and especially these sections has meant a lot to you as well. It really came through. And we'll put all your information in the show notes for the listeners. Coop, do you want to read us out?
Very much enjoyed having you, Gil, and I had a lot of fun. I knew this was going to be a lot of fun no matter what, just based on the reading itself, but I was very excited to have you. We were able to bring you after all. So once again, that will be another edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins signing off.
The roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious. The whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.